Cold Turkey by Sean Putnam. Read by the author. Captain Steve Mitchell badly needed a cigarette. Usually a craving this intense took 2 or 3 smokes to calm it down. Not anymore, though. Steve was trying to quit. With a shaking hand, he pulled a stick of green gum from its wrapper and stuffed it into his mouth. It didn't take the edge off his craving, but the initial shock of flavor cleared his mind a little. He felt tightness in his chest, figured the soldiers must have cracked a few ribs when they brought him in. At least he was breathing fresh air. He could smell pine trees lining the borders of the stockade. Their earthy scent reminded him vaguely of menthol, which made him think of smoking again. The gum had lost its flavor, so he spat it out. God, he needed a cigarette. Steve had decided to quit smoking the same day his life went to shit. He told himself that was just coincidence, but didn't always believe it. When he'd mentioned quitting to Lieutenant Aylman, the lieutenant had grinned. He said all the right things. Good for you, you can do it, all that crap. But something in that grin made Aylman's opinion on the matter clear. It was a waste of time and would end in failure. Maybe Aylman had been right. Maybe if Steve had smoked in the Humvee on the way to the raid, he'd have leveled out. When his men had popped the cellar door, and those kids had stared up at them, eyes wet with tears and terror against the harsh glare of their weapon-mounted flashlights, maybe Steve would have kept his goddamn head. Maybe he would have remembered it's better to be the one pointing the gun than the one it's pointed at. But in the last 5 years, the face of the enemy had changed. They didn't look like narco-terrorists anymore. They looked more like farmers, reporters, professors, and now children. So, with a nicotine craving tightening his throat, Steve ordered his men to stand down. They obeyed, but he saw in their eyes a different kind of craving. He understood, but wished he didn't. 2 days later, Steve discovered he was under official investigation by the CID. Having seen this little drama play out too many times before, Steve didn't wait to be arrested. He packed a change of clothes and a few keepsakes and went AWOL. He left his cigarettes behind. A week on the run, and he hadn't smoked. He kept expecting the intensity of his craving to taper off, but it seemed as strong as ever. Still, he was proud of himself. All that stress, and he hadn't taken a single puff. Before, satisfying that craving had felt like a responsibility. Now, quitting felt like taking some small piece of his life back. So many of his choices these last 5 years had been made for him. Here was one he'd made for himself. In the stockade, Steve wasn't surprised when the guards came for him. He knew the score. They dragged him out to the parade ground. Soldiers, Steve's own men, stood shoulder to shoulder, looking at a platform built at one end of the field, on which stood a tall wooden pole. Steve was forced onto the platform and against the pole. His hands were tied behind him. The craving still pounded at his temples, so severe that it made the rough treatment by the guards seem almost playful by comparison. But Steve knew he could get through it. Wouldn't be long until he was quit for good anyway. Lieutenant Aylman read the charges and pronounced the sentence: death by firing squad. This was all routine. Steve wasn't even the first one today, nor would he be the last. It's tradition, before sentence is carried out, for the condemned to have one last request, Aylman intoned. He held something out. A single, slender cigarette. Instantly, Steve's eyes flicked to it. What's it matter now, he thought. No sense dying with this awful pounding in your head. With strength he'd only lately discovered he had, Steve pulled his eyes away from the cigarette and managed a tired smile. No thanks, he said. I quit. Aylman stared at him, eyes shining with cruel mirth. Then 2 other soldiers stepped to either side of the pole. Hands clamped onto Steve's jaw and forced his lips apart. Steve felt the cigarette shoved roughly between them. He tried to struggle, but the soldier's grip was irresistible. A spark from Aylman's lighter, and the end of the cigarette became a glowing red coal. Gloved fingers firmly pinched Steve's nostrils shut. Steve held out for as long as he could, then sucked a gasping breath between his teeth. He felt smoke sliding down his throat, filling his lungs. He coughed and spat, but already the craving began to ease. The pounding in his temples began to ebb. The guards had released his jaw now. Steve had only to relax his lips, and the cigarette would tumble to the platform beneath him. Instead, he inhaled, again and again. Somewhere below the craving, below the fear of what was about to happen to him, Steve felt ashamed by this weakness. He could see Lieutenant Aylman grinning at him again, and that shamed him too. But the feeling spreading through him now was too comforting, too familiar. In the end, it was so easy to just give in. Then Steve felt the searing heat of rifle bullets ripping through him. His jaw clenched against the pain, nearly biting through the cigarette's filter. He managed a final convulsive gasp, one last puff on one last nail, before what remained of his awareness drifted apart. When the guards approached to remove the body, they saw thin wisps of smoke rising from the ragged holes in its chest. These stank of cordite, but underneath that was another smell, something earthy and pungent. A few of them recognized it and decided it was time for a cigarette.